This is an amazing turnout. Thank you all for being here. And thanks again for that very warm introduction. My name is Sunny Patel, and I'm a user experience researcher at LinkedIn. Like Andy mentioned, I transitioned from academic research into UX research a few years ago. So far, I've been doing research for about 9 years. Started out in an academic institution, did that for about 5 years or so, transitioned into user research about 4 years ago, and was hired as, 5 years with academic research, 4 years more recently, and was hired by a healthcare startup called Grand Rounds to build a research program there. So I was hired as a first researcher. So not only did I build a program there from the ground up, but I also functioned as a research team of one for a few years. And more recently, I am part of a larger research team at LinkedIn. So I'm super excited to be here and talk to you a little bit more about the important role of storytelling in user research, and to also give you some helpful tips along the way. So before we get into things, okay, it's working. Before we get into things, just a quick raise of hands. How many researchers do we have here in the room? Okay, a good number. How many of you are designers who also do your own research from time to time? That's awesome. Okay, great. Now raise your hand if you think of yourself as a storyteller. Great, great, okay. And keep your hand up if you think storytelling is an important part of the research process. And yes, I realize that's a leading question, but that was on purpose. So as humans, we are wired to not only tell, but to enjoy hearing and listening to stories. So much that according to research, 2/3 of our daily conversations are stories. That's incredible. And you may ask why? Because stories are relatable. So stories have this unique power to persuade, to motivate, and to speak to our emotions and our capacity for empathy. So if you think about our role as a researcher, that is exactly what we do, right? We strive to persuade, to motivate our teams, and to foster that empathy for our users. I'll briefly walk you through my research process, and I think Andy gave a good sort of intro to that. Many of you researchers in the room probably share a similar process. So when I first start out a research project, I always kick it off with a kickoff. This is when I bring my team and my stakeholders along the ride with me. I engage them early on in an open discussion. And there are many benefits to engaging your team early on, one of which is that storytelling becomes a lot easier later on if they've been part of the process. Some of the other things that we're doing here, again, as a team, as a group, we're talking about research goals. We're highlighting overarching research questions. That leads us to figure out, who do we want to talk to? Which user segment do we want to include? And then how are we recruiting? So all of that happens in this stage. In the interview stage, well, I interview. It's pretty straightforward, not much to it there. And then the last stage, which is, I loosely kind of call it synthesize, but this is really where the magic happens, right? So this is where the story starts materializing, and you're now putting this narrative or this sort of cohesive story together. So specifically what happens here, you're doing analysis, you're starting to look for patterns and for themes. There's insight generation that is also taking place during this phase. In terms of deliverable, depending on the type of study, there's probably some sort of a deliverable that you're working on. The forms might be a little different. And then communication. So that is the core of storytelling. That is essentially where you're sharing that story or that narrative with your team. I love this quote. The purpose of a storyteller is not to tell you how to think, but to give you questions to think upon. Again, precisely our role as a researcher. And this becomes even more evident a little bit later on when we get to the communication phase, and also figuring out how to keep the story alive, making sure the conversation doesn't end there. Okay, so some of us might be familiar with the idea of a story arc, right? In simplest terms, the story arc or a narrative arc provides a framework for a story, right? So there's a beginning, there's a middle, and then there's an end. Now, if we were to map out the research process onto the story arc, we would see that synthesize, so this is where, again, kind of the elements of the story are starting to emerge, would be mapped onto this upward slope, right? So there's rising action, things are coming together, things are happening. Then we have this communication or communicate stage right at, I don't know if it's hard to see here, but right at this climax or this peak. So this is where the most interesting part of the story is, right? And again, we don't want the conversation to end here. So as the story is coming to a resolution, we're thinking about how to keep it alive and how to make sure things keep going on. Let's start with synthesize. Let's say that you just wrapped up research sessions over a week, right? So let's say you talked to 8 users for about 60 to 90 minutes, spending a lot of time with each one, and you wrap up your last interview on a Friday. What is the first thing that you do besides going to happy hour? You're probably jotting down your observations, right? You're probably coming out of that interview and you're relying on memory at this point to jot down some key things that you saw, and again, jot down those observations. And that's great as a first step. We all do that. But it's also important to go back to the data. So when we get to the analysis phase and when we're starting to look for those patterns, it's incredibly important to not just rely on memory. You know, there are a lot of biases that come into play when we do just rely on memory, right? So how many of us remember catchy quotes that our participants throw out, or a really charismatic participant, right? That's why it's incredibly important to go back to the data. So whether that be videos, raw notes, whatever it is, to kind of see where there are patterns and if what you remember is representative or not. Another way that I like gathering observations along the way is to debrief with my team. So remember back when I said that I involved my team pretty early on in the process, I encourage them to attend research sessions, as many as they can, and participate in the way that they feel comfortable with, right? So they can come and observe, or they can help me take notes, whatever it is. And what I do is I schedule 10 to 15-minute debriefs with them after each session. I know it sounds like a lot, but it's actually really, really helpful because this is a time for me to regroup with them, to do a quick gut check, to hear what they observed, what their perceptions were, and keep them engaged as well. One thing that's really helpful here is that because you're checking in with them throughout the process, when you do your communication or your storytelling at the end, things don't feel like a big reveal. They're not coming out of nowhere. They've been brought along the ride this entire time. Aha, so when you have a room full of designers and product managers watching their users, some of them maybe for the first time, and they're watching how their users are interacting with their products, they're seeing their frustrations, their needs, their pain points are coming up, your team might be likely to start thinking of solutions at this point. And sometimes this happens even when I'm debriefing with them. So again, our role is to make sure that the conversation is focused at that point, right? So not quite ready yet to talk about solutions, and make sure that we're just thinking of observations and looking for patterns at this point. But let's say if solutions come up, which inevitably they will, what I do is I go ahead and put them up in a parking lot, and I make sure that we revisit them later when it is appropriate to talk about solutions. Okay, so we just talked about synthesize and some of the things that go along with it. Next is communicate. So far we've had, again, pieces of the data, pieces of the story kind of come together. What we're doing at this stage is we're putting that narrative together. We're putting that, let's say, presentation together. That's the most common deliverable that I use in my research process, is some sort of a deck or a presentation that can not only be presented during that 1-hour meeting, but that can also live on, right? And there are a few ways to serve up this piece. So if you think about it, Putting a research presentation together is a lot like creating a recipe or creating a dish following a recipe. You can either choose to serve up just the raw findings or just go right into it. When you walk into that meeting, you start with the findings and you leave your audience with it. Or you can take a little bit more time, add maybe a little bit more context, you finesse it a little bit, but what you get is this delicious looking marinara sauce, which is edible, but not quite standalone, at least quite yet. Or what you can do is you can go one step beyond and you can add all the richness and the context behind creating this dish or this story and provide something that turns into a beautiful experience and ends up being quite memorable for your team. So over time, I have come up with this sort of template for putting my research presentation together. And this is what I refer back to every time when I start any kind of a deck. I start off by talking about the research questions. What guided our research? Why did we even do this research in the first place, right? So setting the stage for everyone, for your audience, even people who may not have been part of that research project. Highlighting methodologies is also incredibly important. So depending on if your research was formative or evaluative or generative, you might be using a host of different methodologies. And again, it's important for your audience to know what was the context in which you interacted with the users or spoke with them. Participants, always a great idea to highlight who your participants were. Why were they chosen? What were some of the key attributes? What were the user segments that they represented? And then obviously the bulk of this presentation is focused on talking through those key findings. So that's essentially where you are spending most of the time. Personally, I like including recommendations and next steps, leaving my team with something actionable to do next. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to that part. So when I'm thinking of putting findings together, this is the framework that I follow. So I tell my audience what happened, I help them interpret what it means and why it matters. And I call this the Finding, Insight, Implication Framework. No, I did not come up with this, but this is pretty golden. What this framework allows them to do is make sense of findings, make sense of these observations and these patterns. So remember back when our team was super excited to talk about solutions, right? And all we had discovered at that point were findings. We hadn't quite made sense of what it means and why it was important. So at this point now, that conversation is more fruitful because we have sort of made that connection for why we should think about solutions and why we should think about solving these issues. So let's take an example. This is not a real LinkedIn example, it's just something that I made up, but let's say our finding was most users were unable to complete the online registration form, a form. Our insight here is, so why did that happen? Well, it's because questions in the form could be interpreted in multiple ways. So maybe the copy wasn't clear, maybe something else was going on, but there was some confusion there. And why is this important? Well, there are two reasons. A, most of our users could not complete onboarding, so they abandoned the form. That's not good. And the second reason was that those who did finish or complete the form weren't quite sure of what we were asking them, so there's a risk of inaccurate data, right? So hopefully this example was helpful. Let's go back to the 60 to 90 minute sessions that we did with each user, okay? Let's say that the first half of that session was focused on generative questions, right? So you're kind of exploring a problem space. Let's say the second half of it was focused on you testing a design or a concept. And now imagine how much data comes out of a session or of a research study like that. It's a lot. There's no way you can cover everything in a 1-hour meeting with your team. What you probably want to do at this point is to figure out what you want the audience to take away. What do you want to have stick in their minds when they walk away? And then focus or prioritize your findings to match that narrative. Let's say you uncovered a host of usability issues and it doesn't fit with that narrative. You can always take some time after the meeting to sit with your designer one-on-one and walk them through those issues, right? So things aren't going missed, but you're keeping the conversation really focused when you are talking to your team. This is one of my favorite things to do in a presentation, sharing user stories to create empathy. As user researchers, typically we're probably very, very close to our users, right? We're first in line in talking to them. We get to see them. We get to hear from them. We get to understand their experiences. And our team and our stakeholders are not quite that close to our users. So it's really our responsibility to bring the user voice and the user story closer to our team. In a research project, we try to understand, where our user is coming from, how our product fits into their life, and where they're going next. So somewhat like a journey map, right? And it's important to obviously not lose sight of that. Some tactical ways in which I try to create empathy for our users is I sprinkle quotes throughout my presentation so that I'm using their words to support some of the key findings. Another way in which I do this can be a little bit time intensive, but can be super powerful, is creating a highlight reel or grabbing video clips from your sessions, right? So especially when things get emotional, right? So your team is now hearing directly from the user and seeing their plight and seeing their experiences. So that's always really, really a great idea, and I do that a lot. But also, think about before you pick a quote or a video clip, ask yourself if it's representative or not. That's important. I said earlier that I like providing recommendations and next steps as part of my research presentation, but it's also important to strike a fine balance between being too vague and too prescriptive. So one way in which I like sparking that discussion is by asking how might we questions. Right, so you're taking them to the question, you're not providing an answer, but at this point, because they have the finding, implication, and insight framework, we're ready to talk about solutions and what to do next. So this is the communication phase, right? So this is where the story is building up, you're sharing the story. Our job is to ensure that things don't just end there after the 1 hour meeting, that when everybody walks out and grabs their delicious lunch, that things don't just get lost somewhere or filed away. And so it's important to think about keeping the story alive. And a few ways in which I tend to do that is one, just evangelizing research findings. So the 1 hour meeting that, let's say, I schedule with my team, that's probably not the only time that I'm sharing or I'm talking about this research. So I try to find opportunities where I can maybe go to other meetings. So either I'll sign up for a slot in like a weekly product meeting or a weekly design meeting and continue to talk about this research and evangelize it because someone somewhere might find something interesting and that might spark a conversation. And again, you're ensuring that things live on and they don't just end there with that research study. This one seems incredibly simple, but it can go actually a long way. And it also goes along with evangelizing research findings, right? So being available, being accessible, having your face or your name attached to this research so that when someone does have a question, they know where to find you, they know where to come. So if you weren't taking notes so far, don't worry, because this is the money slide. To quickly recap what we talked about, so we talked about synthesize and stages of that, or phases of that stage, right? So going back to the data, not relying on memory, looking for consistent patterns and themes along the way. We talked about debriefing with the team, making sure they're engaged and participating along the way as well. And then we talked about solutions. If they inevitably come up, that's great. Listen to your team, acknowledge what they're talking about. Just put things in a parking lot so that you can come back to it later. During the communicate phase, we talked about a recipe for a presentation and the components that will help ensure that things live on, that this document can live on as well. We talked about the finding, insight, implication framework and how that can encourage fruitful discussion, especially when it comes to solutions. We talked about prioritizing findings, keeping the conversation super focused, and anything else that fits outside of it, you're maybe talking to your team about it one-on-one. And then sharing stories to build empathy, to really bring the user voice close to your team. And then we talked about providing recommendations and maybe some actionable next steps, because that is essentially what helps us keep the story alive. So you continue talking about it, continue evangelizing it, and you stay available. And what our job is to ensure that the story doesn't end there, but that it continues on into the next story and beyond.
Hi, that was a great presentation. So I'm still trying to understand what the difference between a finding and an insight is, and I feel like I always had trouble with that. So is it fair to say that a finding is something that you observe a user doing, etc., or something that the user said, versus an insight is what about the product or the situation led the user to be thinking or acting in such a way?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if you think about a finding, you can think of a piece of data. So it's really the what happened, right? So when you're in a research study, if a user says, I need X, Y, and Z to ensure that I can complete this task, that's a finding. A finding you can also think about, and this, again, much of this is subjective, right? So there's no hard science behind this. But a finding you can also attribute as maybe a single observation, whereas an insight provides you the why behind the what, right? So now you found the specific behavior. Now let's try to understand what the motivation was behind it or why it happened. So in my example, when the users were unable to complete forms, that's the behavior we saw. We saw people dropping off, not completing, or providing just weird answers. The why behind it was that the questions were just not worded accurately or clearly. So if you think about it, it's the what versus the why. Hope that was helpful. Yeah.
We have another question right here. This is the final question for this round. Oh.
I was interested in what you covered during the debrief session. So is that under the assumption that your stakeholders have been to those meetings, or like what do you show them in those 15-minute debriefs? Just if you could talk a little more about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the debrief, so anyone can attend. These can be observers or note takers who attended the session. Sometimes I have team members who might not have had a chance to watch the user interview, so they'll just pop into the debrief. But honestly, I'm yet again facilitating that discussion. So I'm not really showing anything. We are reflecting on what we just saw. So I'll usually be on a whiteboard and just jotting notes down, and I'll start off by asking, hey, what was interesting? What did we find? Or what did we see? This also helps me because sometimes as a facilitator, I might miss nuances in the interview that someone else is picking up on, precisely the observer. So what I'm doing is just basically getting a list of things together that we saw as a group. And it helps me during the analysis as well, even refer back to that.
Awesome. Thank you,
Great.
Sunny.
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.